lunch bars every day, 12 till 1, 1 till 2, and then also evening events down in Owens Park at the Source Cafe. Today will be over and done by 10 to, so if you need to get off the lectures, don't worry, we'll make sure you are out by then. Today, we have Michael with us, and he'll be speaking on the irrelevant God. How can he be relevant to me? Throughout, if you have questions and you want to text them, I have a phone, so text them to the number up there, and then we'll read them out afterwards and have some time to look at those, and Michael will respond to those, and then maybe give a bit of opportunity for response to that as well. What did you say, anything else? Cool. Okay.
Brilliant, fantastic. Good. If you want to sit down, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 6 seats here. There's a big rocking chair to my left, so do feel free to come down if you want to grab a seat. There's a few more here as well. Just as you're walking down, getting seats, so we will be finished by 10 to. We will have time for your questions, so please do text in to that number anytime during the talk. The added advantage, of course, is if you're finding the talk utterly boring, then you can just texting your mates and I won't know the difference. But do text in with any questions, observations, comments, disagreements. We welcome all of those. We'll deal with as many as we can at the end. We're going to be here every day, 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock this week, so don't worry about lunch. We'll provide the lunch and lots of stimulation for your mind as well. And so do come along through the week, and all the information is on the tables. But we're looking at this question of the relevance of God. How can God be relevant to my life? And I guess to a lot of people in Western society today, not possibly other societies, but in Western society, we tend to think that God is no longer relevant at all to our lives. It seems old-fashioned. That's the kind of thing Granny would do, be into these things, but not for us. It seems to be outdated and totally out of touch with our modern worlds. And so for a lot of people, the idea is God seems totally irrelevant. Now, on the fact that you're here, I'm probably guessing that you might have slightly more interest than maybe some, because you've at least been interested enough to come to a lunchtime talk on the subject of God anyway. Maybe you just came for the lunch and you thought you'd tolerate the talk, but that's okay. But maybe there's a bit more interested, but still, there's a kind of a question that we come back to, which is, well, how relevant can it really be? Given advances in science that give us answers to the big questions of life, given advances in healthcare that mean that we don't need to rely upon God, we've got hospitals to do that, given that we just want to have fun and enjoy our lives, and surely believing in God and becoming religious would be quite the opposite. That would be losing your life and losing your fun. It seems like God isn't relevant. Well, it's interesting how Christians sometimes respond to this. Sometimes Christians say things like, well, what we need to do is we need to make Christianity relevant. And by that, what they really mean is we need to make it cool. So they think that, if we get some kind of Christian rock band and we all wear cool clothes rather than socks and sandals, that everyone will be like, oh wow, Christianity is so relevant because you look so cool. And what we all know is that just about as bad as uncool Christians are Christians trying to be just a little bit too hard to be cool, particularly when they're middle-aged and they're wearing clothes that they should have grown out of a while ago. And so the reality is actually you don't make something relevant or not. Something either is relevant or it's not. God either is relevant or he isn't. It's not a question of making God relevant. Let me try and give you a kind of, maybe a silly illustration, but imagine you were on holiday a few years ago, December 26, 2004, and you're on a beach in Thailand. And you're enjoying the early morning sunshine on the beach, and I walk along and I put up a little gazebo on the beach, and I say, guys, would you like to come to a talk I'm hosting? It's all about plate tectonics and their effects on coastal regions. And you're sitting there saying, look, I'm on holiday. I don't want to come to your silly lecture about plate tectonics. I dropped geography as soon as I could. And then I say, no, come to my lecture, because my lecture is going to be really cool. We're going to have free pizza, and we've got this cool speaker who happens to be a footballer, but he also loves plate tectonics, and it's going to be really cool. It's going to be so relevant. And you're like, no, I don't want to come to your lecture, no matter how much pizza you're serving, it's not relevant. But actually, what I would need to say, what I should have said is, actually, in a few minutes' time, there's going to be a massive earthquake underneath that ocean. And a huge tsunami is going to be hurtling towards this shore. And although you don't think plate tectonics have any relevance to you, actually right at this moment in time, they do. You see, there are some things that don't seem relevant. They seem completely irrelevant, but actually could be very relevant to us. Now, when it comes to God and religion, one of the mistakes is that we can assume that all ideas about God and all religions are the same. And later this week we'll look at how I don't think that is the case. Because of course there are some religions and some ideas of God that aren't particularly relevant. We might say that the ancient Canaanite Baal god is not particularly relevant to our life. We know that storms and rain come from other sources, not from worshipping the Baal god. Or some philosophies might be particularly relevant for those living in certain types of cultures or certain periods in history, but not relevant to us today. But what I do want to suggest, and hopefully back up over the next few minutes, is this: that I think the claims of the historical Jesus are relevant to all people, through all history, in all places, at all times. They are universally relevant. And so what I want to do is just take a few minutes just to look at some of the claims of Jesus that we see in the New Testament Gospels and see what they might mean and see how they might be relevant to us if you're not convinced, okay? And then we'll have questions. So here are, hold on to your seats, 8 claims that Jesus made about himself. Firstly, Jesus claims to be the fulfillment of 2,000 years of history. In Luke's account, in fact the one that you have on your chairs or tables, Luke's account of Jesus' life, we read about how Jesus turned up in a synagogue, a Jewish place of worship, and took a book from the Old Testament, the law, and he read from it. And then he said, "Today, in your hearing, these words have been fulfilled." In other words, he was basically saying all of this stuff that was written by the Jews over thousands of years, it's all been fulfilled in me. On another occasion, he told some religious leaders off because he said, "You have missed the point of all of this Old Testament because it's actually all about me." That's kind of a fairly egotistical thing to say, isn't it? I mean, imagine if I were to walk into church one Sunday and say, "Guys, you've all missed the point of this Bible thing. It's actually about me." That'd be quite an arrogant thing to say. And yet Jesus claims that all of this stuff and all of this religion that had been around for so long was all pointing towards himself. Here's the second thing. He also claimed to be eternal. Jesus was talking with a group of religious leaders and they were debating with him. One of the fascinating things that many people discover when they look at Jesus in the Gospels, in the Bible, is that Jesus' greatest opponents were actually the religious people of his day, which tells us something fascinating about Jesus that would be worth checking out. But Jesus is debating these religious leaders, and they say to him basically, "Well, who do you think you are? We follow Abraham, this guy who had lived and died 2,000 years before, but who do you think you are?" And Jesus says something incredible. You find it in John chapter 8. He says, "Before Abraham was, I am." If you knew your Old Testament, you'd know that word "I am" is what the Jews used to talk about God himself. And Jesus says, this guy who lived and died 2,000 years before, I predate him. He's claiming to be eternal, actually. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford professor, once said, "Only the eternal is eternally relevant." And actually, Jesus' claim here is fascinating. He's saying, I'm not just speaking as a Galilean carpenter with some wisdom that I inherited from my parents. He's saying, I'm speaking with the wisdom of God in eternity for all time. Which is why, and this is really fascinating, 2,000 years later, the teaching of Jesus actually is very relevant. Not just his teaching that has stayed part of our language in the English language today. Actually, if you read it, it's worth doing, and I encourage you to do so. You'll see actually there is an amazing relevance to what Jesus is saying here. This hasn't just been outdated. But that's the second thing. Third thing, he claims to be the only way to God. I live in Bournemouth, down the south coast, and each summer for a number of years we ran a cafe just next to the church where I worked. And we had a number of students coming from all over the world to our cafe, and amongst other things, we would sometimes discuss God, Christianity. And I remember once chatting to a French student in this cafe, and we're having a little conversation. He said to me after a while, he said, well, I think that Jesus was just a good man who had nice ideas. A good man who had nice ideas. So I said, well, have you ever read any of Jesus' nice ideas? And he said, oh, a long time ago. So I said, okay, do you mind if we look at one of them now? So he said, sure. So we opened up a book that was on the table. It was one of the accounts of Jesus' life, John's Gospel. And I just read out one sentence from the lips of Jesus where it says, I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes to God, the Father, except through me. And I read this out, and as I read it out, it was very interesting because my friend sitting across the table looked at me and his jaw literally dropped open. And then he said this, Jesus was not a good man. And I said, what do you mean? He said, Jesus was the most arrogant man in the world to say something like that. And I said, exactly. I mean, if this guy is just making it up, how arrogant can you get? I mean, imagine me walking down Oxford Road this afternoon with a big billboard, I am the only way to God. You'd think, you know, let's call the man in white coats. You'd be right. Yet Jesus, who's respected by so many, says outrageously egotistical things about himself like this. But then I said to my friend, I said, well, imagine it was true. Imagine Jesus actually was God, who he claimed to be. He wouldn't actually be the most arrogant man, would he? I would suggest maybe he'd be the most humble man, because here is God turning up on planet Earth as a carpenter and living in the backwater of Galilee for most of his life. I mean, if I was God and I could turn up at any point, any time and do anything, maybe I wouldn't do that. But I said, and he agreed, the one thing he couldn't be is just an interesting guy. His claims are just too big. So that's the third thing. Number 4, he claimed to be one with God. Jesus talking with some of his followers, and one of the followers of Jesus says to him, well, Jesus, show us what God is like, and that will be enough. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. The Father is the word that is often used in that book to talk about God. And Jesus is basically saying, if you've met me, you've actually met God. If you've heard me, you've heard God. If you've spoken to me, you've spoken to God. Again, it's a huge claim. Jesus is saying that actually God has stepped into human history, that he is God in human form. That we can know not only that there is a God, but what that God is like as we look at the person of Jesus. Here's another one, number 5. He claims to forgive sin. There's a really interesting incident where we read that one paralyzed man is brought to Jesus by a number of his friends. Jesus has become well known for healing the sick, and he's in a house, he's teaching, and the house is so packed because everyone wants to get in, there's no room left. So these guys turn up with this paralyzed man, and unable to get him through the door, they go up onto the flat roof of the Mediterranean house, and they dig through the mud roof, and they lower this paralyzed man into the house. You know, you can imagine what it was like inside. Everyone's kind of crowding back, letting this bed come down into the room. The owner of the house is thinking, a roof. And everyone's thinking, well, what is Jesus going to do? What's he going to do? And everyone's thinking, well, of course he's going to heal him, right? And then Jesus says, son, your sins are forgiven. It's a fascinating thing to say, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because surely the man's greatest need was to be healed, not to be forgiven. But secondly, and the religious leaders picked up on this straight away, what right does Jesus have to go around forgiving people's sin if he's just a Galilean carpenter? And Jesus knows exactly what they're thinking. He knows that they're thinking that he's being blasphemous because he's claiming to do something that only God can do. And he doesn't correct them and say, oh, you've misunderstood me. He says, no, actually, that's absolutely what I'm claiming, and I'll show you that I have the authority to do it. And he raised this paralyzed man to life, and everyone's astounded. See, Jesus is claiming to forgive sin. Let's bring it to the current day for a minute. A lot of people say, well, we don't need forgiveness because there is no such thing as guilt or right and wrong. It's a kind of popular philosophical idea. It doesn't always work in the reality of life when we actually often feel guilt. And maybe one of the reasons why we don't like the idea, or we don't talk about the idea of forgiveness, is we're not sure there is any available. But actually, right at the heart of Christianity is this message that there is a God who is willing to forgive, willing to give us a completely fresh start. I was reading recently about people's Facebook accounts, and graduates now are desperately trying to kind of clean up their Facebook accounts in an effort to get a job, because they know their future employers will go back through the Facebook and like pull up those pictures from that night you can't remember, but they can. And there's that idea of like, oh, we just need to kind of wipe the slate clean, and even when you delete it, the fear that Facebook may still hold them somewhere. But actually in life, wouldn't it be amazing to have kind of the slate wiped clean? Jesus says that's what I came to do. Not to rub it in, but to rub it out. To wipe the slate clean, to give a fresh start. And that's what he claimed to offer. He claimed to forgive. But he also claimed this, that he was going to be the source, that he is the source of life. Now this is kind of ironic, because so many people, when they think about Jesus, think that Jesus is the end of life. And we'll look at this particularly in the evenings this week, as we look at some of the existential desires that we have for identity and freedom, for hope and things like that. And we think that Jesus is kind of counter-opposite of our aspirations for those things. And yet Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it in all its fullness. His claim is that in coming to know and follow him, you don't lose your life, although in one sense you do, but you actually find real life. Life as it was meant to be lived in relationship with God. And it's fascinating, because so many times we think that success or sex or alcohol or achievement or whatever will give us life. And then you look at the people that have achieved all of those things and you discover the one thing they have is not life. And yet Jesus says, I have come to give what we really need and what we really desire. He says that he's come to give us life. And then number 7, he claims to have the answer to death. There's an incident we read about in John's Gospel where Jesus turns up at a funeral. A close friend of his called Lazarus has died. He's been dead 4 days. And he gets to the family and he's greeted by this man's sisters, Mary and Martha. And they're just distraught, as you would expect people to be when you've just lost someone in the prime of their life. And Jesus walks into this situation, a grieving family, a funeral service, as it were. And he says to them, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Now again, think about it. I mean, I've been to a number of funerals, far too many in many ways. And imagine if I were to stand at the front of that funeral and say, guys, don't be upset, stop crying, because I am the resurrection and the life. Yeah, that's an incredible thing to claim, isn't it? Jesus is not just claiming to say, look, I found the answer to death. He's saying, I am the answer to death. And then he backs it up by actually raising this man Lazarus to life. A claim that was so publicly known that actually it led to Jesus' own crucifixion. It's just gained far too much popularity. And then later on, Jesus shows that he has authority over death, not just by raising others back to life, but through going through death and conquering it with his own resurrection. Now I know some of you have got massive questions about that claim, and you can ask later. We'll also look at it on Friday night in detail, because it's such a big claim. It's the centre and foundation of the whole Christian faith. But Jesus says, look, I have got, not even that I've got, I am the answer to death. Now it's interesting because not many people talk about death. It's probably not the kind of topic of conversation on the average Monday morning at the University of Manchester for most of us. In many ways it's a kind of taboo subject. Used to be people didn't talk about sex, but they do now, but now we don't talk about death. And yet, ironically, it's the one thing that will happen to all of us. 1 out of 1 die. The statistics haven't changed. And for all our advancements in our society, the one thing we don't have an answer to is death. And actually, surely the reality of life and death should make us at least stop and think. And if there is someone who claims that death is not the end and that there is life beyond it, and that has backed it up through his own resurrection, surely that has got something worth saying to everybody who's living in a world where we'll die. Jesus says that he has got the answer, that he is the answer. And that trusting in him means that death doesn't need to be the end. And then lastly, he said this. Jesus claimed that your attitude towards him will affect you for eternity. On another occasion, Jesus said this. He said, if you believe in me, then you will have life, now and in the future. But he said, if you don't believe in me, then you won't even see life. Not real life. You might have existence for a few years, but not real life. And God's judgment, God's anger remains on you. And that was a huge thing for Jesus to say. He says, actually, your attitude towards him is not of peripheral importance, it's of absolutely central importance, because he's saying it affects you now, it also affects you in eternity. It's a huge claim to make. And that's why we think these things are massively important. And that's why when people say, well, Jesus, he's not that important, or he's not that relevant, I think, hang on a minute, that's just not the thing you can say. C.S. Lewis, we mentioned him already, said this. He was an Oxford professor, an atheist before he became a Christian later in life. But he said Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. But the one thing that cannot be is moderately importance. He's saying this is either the biggest thing in the world, or just ditch it. It's got no importance whatsoever. But the implications are huge either way. Maybe give you another illustration. You remember the film Armageddon? Okay, a few years ago. Actually, probably it was out so long ago that you weren't kind of watching films when it came out. It was back in the 90s. But anyway, I remember when Armageddon came out. And if you've not seen it, basically it tells the story of an asteroid that's flying towards Earth. And everyone's going to die, but thankfully the Americans save us. In particular, Bruce Willis saves us, doesn't he? Armageddon, and there's this bit in the film where everyone, sorry, we've got some Americans here, I should apologise. But there's a bit in the film where everyone kind of realises that the asteroid is going to hit the Earth. It's not like the one the other week that missed us by a few thousand miles. This one's going to hit and it's going to annihilate everything. And you've got people there in Paris, and you've got people in the Sahara, and they're all kind of listening to their radios and listening to the news. Now, what you don't find is you don't find someone saying, well, you know what, I'm not really into asteroids. Nah, I'm not bothered. Because that would be a ridiculous thing to say, wouldn't it? The point is, however interested you are in asteroids are going to be into you in a few hours' time. And this has implications, okay? Now, it's a very silly illustration, but the point is, if Jesus' claims are true, if he is God stepping into human history, if he is saying this stuff and it's true, then the implications are huge for all of us, for everyone. And if they're not true, C.S. Lewis is saying, Christianity isn't just a kind of nice moral teaching. It's a load of rubbish, and you should just turn churches into bingo halls and get on with your life. It's that big. It's worth looking into for yourself. Well, how can you do that? Well, let me just mention a couple of things. So with these books on your chairs, maybe you're sitting here and saying, well, look, I do think it's ridiculous. I do think there's absolutely no evidence for this. Well, I would encourage you to say, well, have you actually taken time for yourself to check out some of the eyewitness evidence for Jesus? These books uncover one of the gospel accounts that we have of the life of Jesus. And there are many reasons, and we'll look at some of them tomorrow, why we can take these to be credible historical sources. But take it away for yourself. Because I meet a lot of people who've rejected Christianity as ridiculous, but they've never actually taken the time to investigate one of the primary evidence sources for themselves. So do take that away. Get your nose into the evidence and have a read. The other thing you can do is obviously come back. We've got lots of events going on this week, both at lunchtimes, so you're welcome to come here every day. Details of those are on your tables as well. And each evening as well, we'll tell you about where and when they'll be. But opportunities to investigate and ask your questions. And of course you can ask questions now, and I'm sure we've probably got some questions, a number that have already come in. So whilst you're just texting in those questions, let me just mention one other thing. Tucked inside these little uncover books are these little feedback cards. And we'd love you to just take time to fill these out while we have the Q&A. Is that okay? On the back, there's just a space for comments and some reflections on the events. So it'd be great, whether you come to the Christian Union normally or not, just to take some time to fill that out and let us know what you think, okay? There should be pens around as well, if there's not, steal one of someone near you. Okay, so fill out some comments on the back, and everyone could do that. But then on the front, there's a couple of boxes, and one in particular just to draw your attention to, a little box that says, tell me more. After this week, there's going to be a course called Uncover, and we'll be talking about it all week, because it's going to be a course where you can come and really investigate these claims of Jesus for yourself, both looking at the implications of them, but also the evidence for them, the foundation of them. And we'd love you to come to that, and we'd love to tell you about that. So if you want information, tick the box that says tell me more, and then leave your name, and well, no one checks their emails these days, do they? So just leave your phone number, and we'll ring you in the next 24 hours. We won't sell your details to anyone else. Okay, so if you're worried about leaving your details, don't worry. But do leave your details there if you want to tick the box, or if you just want to leave anonymous comments, you can. Okay? But do that now, whilst we have the question time, and then someone will be at the door to collect those as you leave. Okay? But, have we got questions?
Yep.
We have. We'll go straight to questions on the test, and we've got about 15 minutes, so we'll get through as many as we can. Okay? We'll try maybe the shorter ones first.
Okay. That's a short one. How can God be eternal if time isn't eternal?
Okay, how can God be eternal if time isn't eternal? Really good question. And of course, if God were therefore within time, that would be impossible, wouldn't it? If we're talking about a kind of God who is within the cosmos, a God who is, you know, somewhere hiding the other side of the Milky Way, then that wouldn't work, because one of the things we've known since the theory of the Big Bang was put forward is that time is not eternal. That actually time, as well as space and matter, came into existence at a point in history. And so that's why it's very interesting that actually the Bible talks about God being eternal and outside of space and time. That he's not within the created universe because he is the creator of it. He is outside of it, and he set this created universe in motion, as it were. And so it's because God is outside of space and time that he can actually create space and time. If God were just a part within it, then that would be very different. And that's why I'd have to say it's very important, you know, that we talk about the kind of different definitions of God. The biblical definition of God doesn't have any problem with the idea that time is not eternal, because the biblical definition of God is that God is outside of time, and he created it. His relationship to time is different. And so that would be really important to bear in mind. We've got quite a few, but maybe time for one person or two to come back on that, if anyone wants to. Anyone wants to come back on that? You want to? Okay. We go to the next one? Okay, we go to the next one. Okay.
If someone lives their own life without hearing about Jesus, then when they go to hell, they didn't receive salvation. Is that not unfair? Or if someone is born with a hormone imbalance which makes them homosexual, then to be judged for who they are seems unfair, right?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for the questions. There's two questions, really, both of them looking at the fairness or justice of God. On the issue of sexuality, I'm not going to answer that, partly because it's a really big subject, and so we've devoted Thursday lunchtime, one of the sessions, to that whole subject. I don't think I can do it justice by trying to speak about that now, but do come on Thursday. We're not wanting to sidestep the issue, we're just saying it's a big issue, come back, and we've got a whole session looking at it. In terms of the first question, what about people that haven't heard, they live in a part of the world where they're not able to hear about Jesus and the claims of Jesus? And there clearly are lots of people in that situation. What do we say about that? The Bible doesn't specifically answer that question. That's because the Bible doesn't give us exhaustive knowledge for every question that we might like to answer, the answer to, but it gives us sufficient knowledge for every question that we really need the answer to. And for us, that's always a hypothetical question. We are not in parts of the world that can't hear, and we can hear, and so it's always a kind of hypothetical question for us. But it's still a good question, so I do want to try and give some kind of answer. The Bible doesn't give us a dogmatic answer, I said, but I think there are some things, clues that we could take. The Bible does say there are two things everybody can know about God. You find them in the book of Romans in the New Testament in chapters 1 and 2. And the first is that from the creation, the world around us, everybody could know something about God's existence and something about what he's like. Which is why, as Emily mentioned in the first session, there's never been a culture or society that's been discovered that has been naturally atheistic. They may not be Christian, but there is a sense of the supernatural. It seems innate in human beings. And the second thing that everyone can know is something about God's standards from our conscience. So again, it says in the book of Romans in the second chapter that even if we hadn't got God's law in the Old Testament, we would still have it written on our hearts. We have an inbuilt conscience, like a kind of moral alarm clock, as it were. So everyone can know something about God's existence and something about his standards. Now we can suppress that, the Bible says. So it's not surprising that people might suppress that and don't want to look at the implications, because it it does have implications. But it's there. Now, how do people respond to that? Could it be that some people, not knowing all that we might know about Jesus and what Jesus has done, still knowing that there might be a God, knowing that they're not good enough for God from their own conscience, could trust in God somehow to be gracious to them, even though they don't know exactly how that would work out, or how that might be? Could God apply to them what Jesus has done, even though they don't know all the details, like we could? Or possibly. What we do definitely know is that Jesus says we're accountable to how we respond to what we do know about God. And so those that have more opportunity about discovering Jesus are accountable to how we respond to that. And as I said, for us, this is a hypothetical question because we can investigate Jesus. We can look at the primary documents like the Gospels. You can look at the evidence for that. There's books on the bookstools about how you can trust the Bible and how science history of God and things like that. We can investigate and we can make up our minds for ourselves. Okay. Yeah.
So on the similar vein of the question I was addressing, there's a case that people have a tumour in their brain that can suppress their decisions.
Okay.
There's one famous case of a guy in the 60s, and there was a tumour in his brain, and essentially it caused him to go and kill loads of people because he couldn't suppress the thoughts. And he said, he wrote a note before he did it that he can't control himself. Please study his brain, and they found this tumour. So surely if he's done these terrible things, and that's because of this tumour in his brain, then is he judged for what he did?
Okay.
Or is it God's fault that gave him the tumour in the first place?
Yeah. Okay, so the question, there was a discovery of a person who had a tumour on the brain that meant that their behaviour was quite irrational, they did things, is that their fault? Will they be judged for that? Lots of questions related to that. Partly the question of tumours and suffering. We're going to look at that on Friday at 12 o'clock. And I think the reality is, and sadly for some of us, we know people who could have conditions like that, which means that they do things that are irrational. I know someone who's an elderly person now, and in their old age are saying and doing things that are not the true them. It's because their mind is playing tricks on them. And I don't think in those situations God is going to judge someone for doing something that was actually a result of a medical imbalance. But I would also want to say, wouldn't want to say therefore that all our decisions are just a result of medical imbalances. I would say actually I think one of the dignity that we have as human beings is that we are responsible beings. So the fact that some people may have a medical condition which means that they do things which they are not in control of, I think God is well able to understand that we can all therefore claim that the result of our actions is a medical imbalance and therefore we're not responsible.
But if they are in control of their actions, but their brain is just competitive to do that, they've still decided the person behind them to go out and do a terrible thing. That's their decision, but they're compelled by their brain, so surely it's in their control.
And that's where we say, we want to say, they're compelled by their brain, but actually is their brain functioning as it should in that situation? Just fascinating, it's a big subject to look at. Was, the recognition is there was something wrong with that person's brain, that's how it shouldn't be. But the reality is there are lots of people where we're saying, actually, I can't blame it on my brain is functioning as it should be, but I still make decisions for which I'm accountable. Okay. We'll go to the next question, so I think we've got more happening. We've only got 5 minutes, is that okay?
Have you personally ever looked into the evidence against Jesus' claims? There is a fair bit of evidence looking at the other side of the argument, which shows how Jesus' claims were false. Surely we need to look into whether or not what he said was true before we look into how it affects our lives.
Yeah, good question. Thank you for asking that one. Because that's an obvious question to ask, isn't it, after what I've said? I can make all these claims, but how do we know Jesus even said them? And even if Jesus did say them, that still doesn't mean necessarily that I should follow him. I mean, I could make outrageously big claims, but that doesn't mean that you should necessarily follow me. It might mean you should just lock me up. Okay? So it's a good question. And that's why, so a lot of the answers I'll come back through the week, we're anticipating lots of these questions. That's why, for a start, I would come back tomorrow, because we are looking at the issue of how can we trust the biblical documents, particularly the Gospel accounts. And I've looked into that and willing to chat about that at length if people want to. How do we know that the Gospel accounts have not been changed, for a start? And how do we know that they're reliable records of what was actually said and done? And I think there are good reasons actually to say that when you weigh up the evidence and the arguments for and against, we can take the gospel accounts as reliable historical sources. Now, that's not always the popular thing to put forward, but actually when you look at the evidence for it, I think there's plenty there. Okay? So come tomorrow, or there's a book on the bookstore called Why Trust the Bible. It's very helpful on that one. And the other thing to say is, of course I could make outrageous claims, like I said, but you wouldn't necessarily believe me. Why should you believe the outrageous claims of Jesus? And I would say, like I mentioned in the talk, because Jesus not only made great claims, but I would suggest he also backed it up. And the biggest, as it were, verification of the claims that Jesus makes is his own resurrection. It's either is the thing that vindicates his claims, or it undermines all of his claims. And as I said, I'm going to look at that particularly on Friday night. There's another book on the bookstore called The Case for Christ that will go into detail on the evidence of the resurrection. And it'd be worth, again, investigating that. If you can undermine the evidence of the resurrection, you can legitimately get rid of Christianity, and don't worry about it. But what I would say is, just as I need to investigate the evidence that people would put forward against Christianity, and I do believe I do that, so I'll take a number of books and a lot of time investigating stuff written by atheists, stuff written by those who don't believe the Bible. Equally, I want to say to you, make sure you take time investigating stuff on the other hand. If I said, I'm not an atheist, but I've never read a book written by an atheist because I don't want to, because they're biased, you would say, that's a fairly bad argument. If all my arguments against atheism come from a Christian book. Equally, if you're saying, well, I'm not a Christian and I don't believe in Jesus, but I've never taken the time to read anything written by someone who's been convinced by the arguments for Jesus, that's also probably equally a big mistake. So I'd say everyone comes with their presuppositions. Everyone comes with a level of bias. Make sure you read both sides and make up your mind on them. A very quick one. You've got a very quick one?
I find the implication that non-Christians cannot engage with concepts of guilt, wrongdoing, and forgiveness and tough law. Do you believe that Christians have a monopoly on right and wrong?
Do Christians have a monopoly on right and wrong? We'll look at this in the second talk, the first talk tomorrow at 12 o'clock when we're looking at the evidence for God. Certainly what I'm not saying, and sometimes people mishear Christians on this, I'm not saying that Christians are automatically better people than everyone else. We're not claiming that. We're claiming to be forgiven, but not better by it necessarily at all. And I'm not claiming that if you're an atheist you can't do good things or you can't differentiate between good things. I believe everybody's created in God's image, and even if we deny the existence of God, it doesn't stop us having a sense of conscience. What I think I am saying is that outside of the objective existence of God, what is the basis for, the rational basis for making those absolute moral statements? Someone like David Hume would have said, without the existence of God, you can't make absolute moral statements. They're all relative. Now it's interesting that today, many of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, people like that, and Sam Harris in particular, are wanting to say you can make absolute moral statements and you don't need God to do that. But actually there's a big rejection of them, not from the Christian community, but actually often from the atheist community saying, I'm not sure you can. But if you want to look into that in more detail, we'll look at that tomorrow when we look at some of the evidences towards God's existence at 12 o'clock. So it's a big area to look at. I'm really sorry we're out of time. There are probably more questions. So, before we have the notices, can I just say, if you want to chat more, we're not going to kick you out. You are welcome to stay. I'm around here at the front, so you can come and chat to me. There's other guys around that would be happy to chat as well. So chat around the tables where you are if you don't have to rush off for a lecture. If you've got to rush off for a lecture, that's okay. But if you want to meet up and chat at another point, there'll be people like myself that will be around all week with no lectures to go to, and lots of time to chat. So we'll arrange a time and we'll buy the coffee, you can bring the questions, and we can talk more, okay? So do take us up on that. It's not that we don't want to answer your questions, and we will continue to do so as the week goes on. Great.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you everyone for coming. If you need to rush off, do go. There's loads of pizza at the back, so feel free to grab more of that, or if you need to go there, grab it on your way out. Just to say that tonight we are meeting at Owens Park Cafe, which is it's called the Source Cafe. It's on Owens Park campus, just across from the reception. and that will be on identity, and it's called What Am I Worth? It's at 7:30, so please come along to that. There'll be music, cake, drinks, and a talk again. There's a bookstore there where all the books are £1, so feel free to grab any of those. The uncovers, the books on your tables, take them away, have a read, investigate for yourself. Tomorrow again with that, with the invented God, so 2 talks on the invented God, and the feedback forms as well are around, so if you could fill those in and post them in the box at the back, that would be great. James?
Also, if you're international students, you can lecture with you guys as well. So we're meeting at 10 to 6 today at Hyde as well, on Old Road. And we're going to have an international meal. Today's theme is English. And we're going to have a shorter version of the English on the table. So, more than welcome to come on, guys.
So thanks for coming. Eat pizza, enjoy, and have a